welcome viewers and listeners to another edition of Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. Joining us tonight is technical operator Mr. Devin Bissoon. We are discussing ethnic equity and economic development in Guyana. Our guests tonight are Mr. Vincent Alexander, well-known election commissioner. So welcome viewers and listeners to another edition of Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. Joining us tonight is technical operator Mr. Devin Bissoon. We are discussing ethnic equity and economic development in Guyana. Our guests tonight are Mr. Vincent Alexander, well-known election commissioner GCOM in Guyana, has been in this program several times. Mr. Ravi Dev, who has also been on the program multiple times, a former leader, or I should say leader of ROAR, former party in Guyana's parliament. He's also a lawyer. Professor Taran Kemraj, professor in Florida. Mr. Dion Abrams, who's an educator and a stalwart of the people in Guyana. And joining us later will be Dr. Terence Blackman, professor at the Medgar Evers College in the mathematics department. Gentlemen, welcome all. Thank you for joining us tonight, viewers and listeners. We are discussing once again ethnic equity and economic development in Guyana. Perhaps we should just recap again. Last time we talked briefly about equity, if we could redefine equity again for our viewers and listeners. If we may begin with Mr. Vincent Alexander, I think you gave a very good explanation and definition of equity last time. Would you like to recap for us?
Well, I did on the last occasion see equity as an equalizer. That is a mechanism used among people who are not at the same par, not the same level, to give some advantage to the person who's below par, so they can both start at the same level in pursuit of equal opportunity. So that you have equal opportunities, but you can't really access the opportunities equally if you're starting at different levels. So what equity seeks to do is to bring you up to par in terms of where you're starting from, so you can indeed equally access equal opportunities. So equity is in some regards about equalizer.
Professor Dr. Taran Kemraj, you are an economist and professor of international affairs. You want to add to that definition of equity?
Yeah, it's a fair definition. Yes, economists will spend decades discussing this issue, and in keeping with the nature of the discipline, we have to measure it. So, for example, equity does not mean that everyone will earn the same pay, right? Equity has a sense of fairness based on your qualification, your experience, and your major. I mean, one of the features of a modern economy is if you study computer science or economics, you're going to have a higher average pay than if you majored in anthropology or history. It's the way the market works, right? Equity doesn't mean that you earn the same pay. However, it becomes a problem if you are of a particular ethnicity or a gender, and given all these factors, right? Given all these factors, meaning if we have two persons, right? Let's say an Indo-Guyanese and an Afro-Guyanese with the same qualifications, the same experience, the same major, and they are having a disparity in earnings, then you have a problem, right? So, so equity is, how is this measured in economics? There are quite a few measures. I have a whole book on the shelf, but I'm going to give you the two fast and most popular ones. The Gini coefficient is a very popular one. And unfortunately for Guyana, The last Gini coefficient that was done was 1998. That's the last number I have.
Yeah,
Okay.
Taran, if we may come back with the illustrations and examples later on, let's just get the definition out of the way, and then you could cite specific examples. Ravi,
yeah, well, one more point is that
okay.
Overall, I mean, certain level of inequity is necessary to drive economic development, right? So if you are going to have someone who invents something that is critical technology, and that person cannot have some level of benefit from that, right? Let's say you take it away, as under a pure communist system, then what is the incentive for innovation, right? Note what I'm saying. Equity is extremely important. I have a more quantitative view of equity than a qualitative view. Another way of thinking about equity, and this is a recent, very popular way of thinking of equity in economics, is let's say someone is born in a particular class, right? Let's say you're born poor. If the society is such that you stay poor by the time you die, you have a serious problem. And if you are born rich and you stay rich by the time you die, you also have a serious problem. So can we have that upward mobility and downward mobility, right? Based on your experience, your inventions, your education, your talents, can you write great music? Can you sing great music? Can you do great poetry? These are the things that will drive distributional changes. So when I hear discussions of equity, I also want to hear about measurements and some specifics. So I can stop there for now.
Okay, Ravi Dev.
Well, it's good that we have Taran on the program, because he's given us a view as to how economists look at equity. And interestingly enough, even though the founder, so to speak, Smith, Adam Smith, back in 1776, wrote on ethics and ethical concerns before he wrote his famous treatise on economics. Along the way, economists forgot about that. And it's only recently that they've had to be dragged, kicking and screaming, I may say, to consider equity. And you have one fellow, for example, Amartya Sen, out of Bengal, who has done a lot to bring back the notion of equity and what these guys don't want to call ethical economics. Be as it may, though, but I think Taran makes another point, which is that, and this is one of my pet peeves in Guyana, that we have all these politicians running around the place talking of economic development, talking of all matter of inequalities and so on, but they're not giving us that philosophical perspective on how they see equality or how they see equity, because these are embedded in particular positions. And the irony, of course, is that we started out with a Jagan and a Burnham who clearly defined their perspective. They both saw themselves as from a Marxist standpoint, which has its own premises on equity. And we all learned those as kids when I was a boy, from each according to his, what was that again, Vincent? To his ability, to each according to his need and all that, because that's a premise of equity. At the early stage and then later, its focus is on just your needs. So that's a perspective. So I would say two things to conclude: that I do believe, even though my first degree is in economics, I have a very strong feeling of the need for equity and such discussions when we talk about development, or else it's all immaterial, and that therefore we ought to situate it and let it be known what is our philosophical position on the whole issue, especially now that we are in the midst, and we were plunged in 1989 under something called neoliberalism, which has its own premises on what is equitable and what is fair. That's for me at this point.
Okay, so you did mention something about equality there, but so definitely equity would involve equal opportunities and fair play for all. Dion Abrams, if I may just hand over to you now. You want to add to equity?
Well, I was a moderator last time, but equity for me, like all of the players have said, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to go down the road of economic theory and all of that. But justice and fair play are key components of it. Doesn't matter what society you're in, particularly in a society where there are differences like ours along racial lines and so on. And if we are dealing with social cohesion, then equity in terms of the distribution of resources is critical to stability and to every other component of the society. Professor Kemraj Taran said that some measure of inequity is necessary in society, but that measure, I don't believe it is something that must be fostered on society, particularly by an administration that is supposed to be looking into the interests of all the people. Because when we have elections, elections are for campaigning and so on. But after the elections, then the government really should be looking at the interests of the nation as a whole, not simply sloganeering, but really thinking about how they can move people forward and lift their standards so that, you know, the gap between rich and poor and those who are having and those who are not having can be lessened.
So our topic again is ethnic equity and economic development in Guyana. If I may, over the last week or 2 weeks, appearing in the news in Guyana is this nasty word, apartheid, which was brought up for a forum or rally last Sunday, which was postponed for whatever reason. I was just wondering if you could spend some time addressing it, because it is a very important concept. And if I may ask Mr. Vincent Alexander, this whole idea of apartheid, I don't want to focus so much on South Africa, Namibia, and Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, but do we have apartheid in Guyana? Have you ever had apartheid in Guyana? And if so, how do we address it?
All right, let me respond to the question this way. First of all, to say yes, there was apartheid in Guyana. I say that because if one looks at what pertained in a place like Linden, where there was not only social and economic separateness, but geographic separateness, it literally mirrored in some regards the apartheid in its classical and typical and original form. So I've just given one example, there may be other examples, but I would say yes, Guyana has experienced apartheid, though we may not have called it that name at that time. A place called Linden, the Tuka was reserved for the whites. The Mackenzie was reserved for the middle technical people, and Wismar Christianburg was reserved for the working people. And not only was that geographic separateness, but it was accompanied by levels of discrimination, levels of exclusion, levels of preference, and it was a typical system of apartheid, though it was not necessarily apartheid at the national level, but in those days, those areas would be called company towns. So the town is an apartheid, a town. Now, so I referred to the classical and typical definition of apartheid. And I don't think we can avoid that because apartheid has an origin in terms of where and how it originated and how it was defined and where it originated. if one imports that definition into Guyana, the very fundamental aspect of apartheid, which was separateness in terms of geography, I would not say that that separateness in terms of geography applies to Guyana at this time. And so in those classical and the classical and conventional way, one cannot simply say that Guyana has apartheid. Whilst the separateness was kind of foundational, the basic principle that informed apartheid, there were secondary elements of discrimination, for example, in terms of jobs, in terms of movement, and things like that. One may argue that in Guyana, one could identify some elements of some of the secondary elements of apartheid. And I don't think secondary elements can suffice to determine the definition of the phenomenon. So whilst the issue is real insofar as there may be secondary elements, and one doesn't know where that would lead to, I don't think that one can come to the conclusion that we do have an apartheid situation here, because the fundamental of apartheid used to exist, very conscious system of separateness, followed by the secondary elements, and that conscious system of physical separateness does not necessarily exist anymore. I wouldn't stretch it to say that the evolution of a Plateauville 1 or a Plateauville 2 is in fact that kind of separateness that apartheid represents.
Do you agree there is an emerging apartheid system in Guyana?
I would say that there are elements of the secondary things of apartheid that are present. Whether that is leading to fundamental apartheid, I don't think that one can take the trends as yet to take you there, because I don't see a trend of the physical separateness which is fundamental to apartheid. It doesn't mean that one should not be aware of what apartheid entails. One should not discern if there are elements of it. All of the elements of it are bad, and therefore, if they are there, one should be addressing it.
Ravi?
Yeah, as Vincent alluded to our colonial history, we can't ignore that. Because what we saw unfolding or had unfolded in South Africa was merely an extreme version of that which was present throughout the British Empire. There's no question about that, apart from its dominions, which were all white settler dominated. So there were elements of that. And this is where we have to be very, very clear about this, that apartheid was founded on a certain notion of race, which, as I said, it's my last time, while colonialism might have been finished at this particular time here in '66 in Guyana, the notion of coloniality, as propounded by Anibal Quijano, still permeates most of our social relations in the world. And racism is one of those notions that has been firmly embedded there and has spread not only in the British Empire, but throughout the world today. And I think we can't escape that, and we have to come back. But the notion of apartheid as institutions springing from the premises of racism and white or European superiority existed when I was a boy. Every sugar plantation had this. At Iflat, I lived right literally under the smoke of the chimney from Iflat Estate. And next to that, you had what we call the big manager house, the administrative manager. And next to that was the senior staff compound. And then you had the junior staff compound. And then, believe it or not, we still had a nigger yard. In Ifluk, my father-in-law, they came from nigger yard. And we casually said he's from nigger yard. And this one is from bong yard. And we had something called Bajan quarters. So every facet of your social life was regulated as to where you could stand. Junior bookkeepers would be in the junior staff, and there were certain compounds that you couldn't enter. I always resented, I never forgot it as a boy, the whites who played tennis, lawn tennis. And some of my friends would go there to run for the ball, and at the end of it, the big manager's wife would throw coins at them. And I refused. I felt it was so degrading. But that's how they saw us, these little kids scrambling for coins and that. So yes, there was those elements of apartheid at that time. But you see, I want to come back to our present. And 2 weeks ago, I wrote a piece because I noticed our whole rhetoric, our discourse in Guyana was becoming coarser and coarser. And as I had done way back between 2009 and 10, when there were strong calls by some that we must get rid of this elected dictatorship. That's what it was, the PP was called then, and we should come out in the streets and all that. And I cautioned, I said, Guyana is changing. The demographics are changing, and we need some moderates. And lo and behold, 2011 happened. So in my article 2 weeks ago, this is what I quoted. I gave the advice from a fellow who was at Harvard University, a professor for a very long time. Then he returned to his native Canada and became the leader of the Liberal Party there, Michael Ignatieff. And he said this, after leaving academic life and entering politics, and he said this, and I want to say it's very, very, very crucial to us in Guyana today, because the people who are talking about emerging apartheid, I looked at the table and they were all academics. And this is what this academic from Harvard who entered politics said. In academic life, and I quote, false ideas are merely false, and useless one can be fun to play with. But in political life, false ideas can ruin the life of millions, and useless ones can waste precious resources. An intellectual responsibility for his ideas is to follow their consequences wherever they may lead. But the politician's responsibility is to master those consequences and prevent them from doing harm. And this is my problem with bringing in notions like apartheid into the Guyana discourse, when I feel we are at the cusp of moderate politics, because you can have individuals out there who will grab onto this word called apartheid, bring up in their minds, because that's what it connotes, as I said, even before the term was thrown out, connote in their mind us being separate, people being thrown into jail, Mandela going into jail, and they may take extreme measures, like what we had when we had that gang that were called African Resistance Fighters in Buxton. And I see us heading in that direction if we are not careful with our words and consider their consequences.
Professor Kemaraj,
Yes.
is much younger than us. I don't know if you experienced those kind of things that Vincent.
Well, I'm not going to get into the colonial era.
But I experienced it. So, but
I'm not here tonight to talk
about
about
inequity.
colonialism. Yes. I'm here to talk about contemporary Guyana. But I'm glad Ravi brought up Amartya Sen, because if you want to discuss apartheid, a very good rule of thumb would be to use Sen's approach. And Sen's approach to inequality and development is human capabilities, right? If the system is allowing people to have a flourishing of capabilities, then it cannot be consistent with apartheid, right? And those capabilities are going to come from education, the ability to start businesses, free to go anywhere, free to read any literature, and so on. So when I use the Sen criterion, do I see apartheid in Guyana today? Well, no, I mean, it's absurd. I mean, I thought I wasted 15 minutes a few minutes ago before the show because GHK Lal was talking about apartheid. And this is an example where being a top man, you know, you have a nice accent and so on, but you deliver nothing. And I really don't like to waste my time. And I felt I wasted 15 minutes of my life listening to GHK Lal a few minutes ago. Now, what did GHK Law? I'm waiting for the evidence. This man is saying Guyana has apartheid, and I'm waiting for the evidence. Here is the evidence. The man said that Region 4 are denied, Region 4 and Region 10 are denied resources by the government. Well, well, I mean, I just came back from Guyana. I can tell you pretty much all the development in Guyana is taking place in Region 4, right, and 3, right? Region 6, which has a large Indian population, is largely denied, just like Region 10, right? So again, if we use sense approach, it's a very nice way of thinking about this problem. So for example, the government built, and I really don't like to be here defending the PPP. I'm not defending the PPP, but the government just built a new highway. Well, I mean, open a new highway. Well, I haven't seen one race being denied driving on that highway. I can tell you that highway is going to save time. It's going to enhance human capabilities, right? Because if you can save time, you can do more. You can increase your productivity, right? So I don't really I don't think the evidence bears out supporting apartheid in Guyana. I wish we can use other language. You know, I got to go back and clarify a point I made earlier because I said in a society, certain level of inequality might be necessary. Now, what do I mean? In economics, we have an idea known as rent seeking. And if a man or a woman got rich because of their political connection and they got all the contracts, that is not wealth through innovation. That is wealth through rent seeking, right? I mean, it's a moral issue as well, and pretty much it's frowned upon. However, if somebody invents a technology, right, that can make us live longer, right, can make us do things more productively, should that person be paid the same as the person who did not invent the technology? You know, and these are some of the issues. Of course, there's a big discussion. Should we have patents? Should we have copyrights? I know this was a discussion a few years ago. Well, as someone who published and you know, I mean, you could imagine I support copyrights because I don't want people plagiarizing my stuff. So I mean, should I just should I get nothing for all the time I put into my stuff? So there's a difference between rent seeking and there's a difference between true innovation that leads to human flourishing, enhanced capabilities of people, and all of that. So in short, I think we should use different terms to describe the government. Rent seeking, patronage, yes. We know Guyana. There's a big problem with the ethnic voting. Well, I hope the demographics are going to change. I still have my doubts. Fundamentally, it will stay bi-communal. But if it changes, that's great. But I'm hoping that we can discuss the problems, the true problems, so that we don't have to get sidetracked with these topics. So my answer is a resounding no. I cannot see any evidence of apartheid in there.
Okay, so thank you, Taran. I'll come back to you for some statistics, figures on equity, inequity. But let's hear from Dion. Dion, Professor Kamraj clarifies and explains what he means by some level of inequality is acceptable in society for progress and development.
Well, I don't doubt that there is need for some levels of inequity because it drives others. It's an impetus for others to try to lift their level of achievement in society. But I think sometimes we simplify what is happening in Guyana, and we try to cloud the realities that are faced by certain ethnic groups, particularly Amerindians and Africans here in Guyana. Rent seeking, as he said, is a major problem in our society. But then also, when the idea of apartheid is touted by the group that would have raised that issue, I guess I'm thinking of going into their minds. Possibly, we're looking at situations like Soweto and you know, the children of Soweto were slaughtered. You talk about Golden Grove recently, where police went in there indiscriminately shooting at people and so on. These are phenomena where young black men are targeted and killed. You know, then you begin to question whether there is, in fact, a system that is designed to victimize people in one way and allow others to escape. We have a vice president who has come under criticism for statements he himself publicly made of you know, granting largesse to Chinese businessmen, and up to now, you know, nothing is happening. But as soon as you hear a word like apartheid, then there is a big outcry. He's the first one to jump up and make a whole lot of noise and to create, you know, disparaging remarks about a black organization and to castigate people to the point of you know, defamation and all of that. So in the minds of people, you know, you have to look at the other side, apart from thinking of taking the broader picture, but you have to think in terms of how those who are affected are feeling in a society where they believe that they are not being treated in a way that there is equity and equality, and they are being sidelined in many respects, and then they're brutalized whenever they try to raise their voices in a similar fashion that was evident in Mozambique, in South Africa, and those places.
Vishnu, if I might.
Yeah, Ravi?
I think Dion has raised an example or a few examples that to me proves the point I was making, which is that the term itself is incendiary in the Guyanese context and really misplaced. Because let's take the thing of Soweto and as to what happened in Soweto. The point is not that the police killed youths in Soweto. We know all that. The point was that prior to those killings, after 1948, the Group Areas Act was passed, and blacks and Indians were forcibly removed from some of their settlements or their areas and were put into specific areas where they had to live. And Soweto was one of those areas, which then became a slum in terms of the amenities were available and all of the other things that were missing vis-a-vis the white areas. So Soweto is not just the killing, it is what led to the formation of Soweto and what led that killing. And we don't have that in Guyana. Nobody has really been forced out of their homes by a government and told that you can only live here and you can't live somewhere else. And because where you're told that you can live, you just can't get out of it. So we don't have that. And that is what apartheid is all about. In terms of the killing and the killing of black youths, I have written at least 3 or 4 times about that in Rivers View, where that fishing complex behind Meadowbrook is, that an Indian man, I believe his name is Chitram Singh, was killed in identical circumstances to Royston Bacchus. He was killed. He was a fellow who evidently was abusing his wife. The wife called the police. The police tracked him down. He was playing cards with members of his family. He ran. They ran after him. They claimed he had a gun. They shot him. They killed him and left him there No, now if you shoot a man with a gun, the gun would have fallen. No gun to today has been found. The man is dead. Up to today, we don't have an explanation from the police. Has there been an investigation into his killing? Has there been professional, the police professional association or whatever they are called? Have they inquired into it? We have tried to get these answers and you still can't get any word. So we have a problem with a police force that is unprofessional. Let's not bring in apartheid into it. During when you had the uprising up in West Bobis about the election results, a young boy, Devon, was killed and shot. A girl with my daughter's name, Anuradha, was shot with pellets. Nobody talks about that. Devon is gone, he's dead. They claim that he was attacking a policeman. The evidence shows that he was nowhere near where the policeman was being attacked. So what I'm saying, and I don't want to go off topic, we have a problem with the police force. More than any other institution, ROAR has been talking about this since 1998 and was a deafening silence for 2 decades about professionalizing the police force, including from the PPP. And so today we now hear this big uproar. It's nothing new. We put forward detailed recommendations way back in 1980 how to professionalize the police force. Okay.
Okay, so we are being joined now by Professor Dr. Terence Blackman. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for joining us, albeit late. Thank you again.
Thank you,
I
and apologies
don't know if
to
you're
you.
prepared about apartheid, or would you like to come back a bit later?
I'll come back a bit later on the question of apartheid.
So Tehran, you have done studies about economic development in Guyana. I was just wondering, do you have any kind of, you talked about numbers, that numbers are very, very important. Do you have any numbers that make a case for equity, inequity, about distribution of resources in Guyana, economic inequity?
Well, I mean, we know that Guyana, you know, what people have done are to show broadly broad measures of inequality, right? So, for example, I actually got a Gini. I was doing some reading, and I got a Gini coefficient for 1955. Now, the Gini coefficient, this is colonial era, right? In 1955, a researcher did the calculation based on the population survey of the time, and it was not from 1955. We didn't get another one until 1998, right? And now the Gini coefficient is not the best measure, but it's what we have. Just understand this, right? Talking about these issues in a place like Guyana is very problematic because we don't have the data, right? So understand what I'm saying. So there is a broad measure like the Gini coefficient. If the Gini coefficient is 1, it means that a single citizen of the country earns all the income. If the Gini coefficient is 0, it means it's perfect equality, which is something that is utopian, right? As I have argued earlier. Now, the closer you get to 1, the worse it is, right? So in 1955, Guyana's Gini coefficient was 42, right? I mean, maybe be clear. Let me get this. I think it was 42, 1955. And in 1998, the one that the World Bank did, it was 45. So we see after colonialism, this measure of inequality, which is not a great measure, but it's still something, it actually worsened under our own people, our own government, our black and brown running our lives. Inequality has worsened according to this measure. Okay. Now, a very bright young economist, his name is Constantine. This is his specialty. He's been doing some work on this, and he'd use another measure, something called the Palmer Index, and he has found that from the 2000s, overall inequality. I mean, we're not talking ethnicity here. Overall inequality has increased in Guyana, right? Using the Palmer Index. Okay. Now, let's get to the real problematic one, which is the issue here, I feel, and it's the issue with all of this apartheid discussion, right? We have to think of inequality two ways, right? There is wealth inequality, who owns the wealth. And by wealth, we mean things like land, who owns the, the buildings, who own the financial assets, and so on, right? That's wealth, how we store our wealth. Money's in the bank, who owns that? Do we have any ethnic data on that? The answer is absolutely no, we don't, right? Nobody's ever done anything. What I have done in the Fabric News is to use inference. So for example, let me take land, which is a big issue, and it's a very emotional issue. This is why I've argued Guyana needs land reform. We have to address this issue of ancestral lands and all of that, right? Let's just take land. Now, 2% of the land mass of Guyana, right? 2%, and I'm going with 2014 data, this is the last data I have, right? 2014. 2% of the land mass of Guyana is owned by private citizens, right? Okay, I mean, they have titles to the land, okay? 7% of the land mass of Guyana in 2014 is owned, is leased land, right? And it's leased back to foreigners and locals. Does that make sense? Remember, land is an important wealth, right? I'm saying 2% is owned by private citizens of Guyana. They have titles. 7% is leased, right? Okay. 14% is Amerindian common lands, as you all know. And the rest, 84%, is owned by the government of Guyana, the state. So here it is, very important wealth. Most of it is owned by the state, okay? And those that are leased, half of or more is leased to foreigners, right? Foreign loggers and foreign gold miners and so on, right? Now, Dr. Ramesh Gampat did a heroic effort to try to figure it out from, he came up with an estimate of the total building stock. Again, how do you know unless you go on the ground and do surveys who owns the buildings, right? Right, so now, so what I've done are things like that, right? Now, the other kind of inequality is not wealth, it's income, right? Income, there's a difference, right? Of course, after we consume, and the sum of income over time should add up to wealth, right? So let's talk about income. There is a little bit of studies done on ethnic income inequality. So for example, this same economist, he's used the LAPUP data. It's a free data online. I mean, if you can process it, and again, understand what the LAPUP data is, right? It's a survey that's done periodically by University of Vanderbilt in Guyana, and they usually have a sample of about 1,550 approximately. It's a decent survey, and they ask people to talk about scales, ranges of earnings, right? You know, Guyanese don't tell you how much money they make, right? This is one of the perils of doing these types of surveys, right? But nevertheless, they'll ask you, how much did you make? Did you earn any income this year? Yes or no? How much did you make within this range? How much? And how much above this range did you? Or they will ask, did you make anything above this range, right? And that kind of data, I don't want to bore you with the numbers. I have it all typed up here, but I looked at it, and there is no evidence of systematic discrimination, right? Or in ownership. So for example, in the 2014 survey, 29% of Afro-Guyanese said they were making over 206,000 Guyana dollars a month, right? This is 2014. 35% of East Indians or Indo-Guyanese said they were making over 206,000, and 25% of mixed Guyanese said they were earning over 206,000, right? I'm going to come to the latest survey, which is in the latest one, but in a moment. But of course, someone mentioned Amerindians, and it is true that Amerindians do the worst on these measures for various reasons. If you use sense approach, is there any government that tries to take away the capabilities of Amerindian, try to make sure that Amerindians are suppressed? I can't think of the PNC doing that. I can't think of the PPP doing that, right? From a SEN perspective, right? Amerindians' problem is largely a settlement issue, right? If you live in small communities and you have small markets, then it's a problem with earning income. But then we can't expect people to uproot themselves and come to the coastal plain and leave your heritage and all of that, right? So I want to say I'm focusing on mixed Indo and Afro-Guyanese. I'm not ignoring the Amerindian community from these surveys. They have the worst, but it's not their fault. This is an issue of geography. Geography determines economic outcomes, largely determines economic outcomes. In the 2016 survey, interestingly, 34% of Afro-Guyanese now said, from 29 the last time, 34% said they're now earning over $206,000 a month. Okay, it flipped. East Indo-Guyanese now said 27% of them said they're now making more than $206,000 a month, right? And the mixed population, the 44% said they're now making a lot more than $206,000. So the data fluctuate. What explains that fluctuation? I have some hunches, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. But just to show you, this data was analyzed for other years going back to 2006, and again, there is no systematic evidence of the evidence does not support the thesis of apartheid. One final piece of statistic that we should be aware of, though, is the poverty data, right? And again, we don't do well as a country collecting data, so these are old statistics going back to 2006, 2011, right? This is what we have to work. What we have, we have to use what we have, right? Because we have to put some numbers so where our mouth is, I feel, and my calculation is from the last survey, there are 90,000 more East Indians who live in poverty. Remember what poverty means. You're living on less than $5 a day, right? There are more East Indians who live in poverty, 90,000 more East Indians who live in poverty than African Guyanese in Guyana, right? So let's keep that in mind. So again, to answer your question, Vishnu, these are not straightforward issues, but I use a process of elimination and I go and pluck out numbers. I just hope that the Bureau of Statistics will get the next population census right and that we can have some proper number and have some context. Now, what?
Taran, if I may interrupt you for a moment, let's take a break. When we come back, either you or Professor Blackman can continue.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take a trip this year to tour the beautiful Dubai and Abu Dhabi with Globespan. This package includes a round trip from JFK to Dubai with sights that are a beauty to behold. Visit the Dubai Golden City from views at the top of the Burj Khalifa, or tour Abu Dhabi and visit the Ferrari World theme park. Experience the desert safari with a barbecue dinner and belly dancing, and also have a Dow cruise dinner. All of this happening on September 23rd to 29th with Globespan. Call in Guyana 227-1701, that's 227-1701, or in the United States 212-243-0865, that's 212-243-0865.
Are you missing homemade food, snacks, drinks, roti and curries, or have a busy schedule? Then get your favorite curries and roti delivered directly to your home with all from one supplier. Come order your duck, goat, or chicken, fully cooked and ready to eat with dal puri or bus up shut. We also now have chicken tikka masala or lamb vindaloo available with regular naan or garlic naan. Don't forget to add your solo, icy, coconut water, or Nestle drinks to these delicious meals. Select your choice, and load your box and let allfromonesupplier.com deliver directly to your home. All From One Supplier has you covered for all your food. Plus if you need pepper sauce, curry powders, fish, meat, ghee, and so much more. We also have tasty pastries like pine tarts, cheese rolls, currants rolls, coconut rolls and so much more. Sales are ongoing every week, and your first order is 10% off once you apply the coupon code, Globespan24x7. Log on to allfromonesupplier.com today and purchase. Allfromonesupplier.com is your one-stop shop for all West Indian items, and remember it's free shipping to all US states.
So welcome back, viewers and listeners. You are watching Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Noor Singh, with technical operator Mr. Devin Bissoon. We are joined for this discussion on ethnic equity and economic development in Guyana. Joining us tonight is our professors Terence Blackman of Medgar Evers, John Cameron out of Florida, Mr. Dion Abrams, Ravi Dev, Vincent Alexander. Let's hear from Professor Blackman. We haven't heard from him yet for this evening. We were just talking about ethnic equity development. We had brought in apartheid to illustrate whether there is or isn't inequity in Guyana. What are your views on this subject?
So I want to start off just by saying, apartheid is a very emotionally resonant area, and for a moment, let's set aside the question of apartheid.
I agree.
In Guyana, and so I'll set that aside. I think the question for us is to really kind of zone in on the question of ethnic equity and its relationship to and what that means within the context of economic development in Guyana. And like Taran, what I did in preparation for the program was to begin to look for data that made sort of comparisons between, Indo-Guyanese income, Afro-Guyanese income, wealth, as he defined it in terms of the ownership of the means of production, businesses, etc. And there is very scant data. I too looked at the LAPOP thing that is done by Vanderbilt University, and I think the last year of study they have something in 2021, and the point is, I think for us as Guyanese, I think the first item of business is for us to really begin to quantify in some concrete way the data, so as to really have this discussion in an effective manner. So that's the first point. There's very little data for us to make kind of informed decisions about. Okay, so having said that, then I think we go to, and our discussion is really kind of an anecdotal one, and it's in a sense precipitated by the discovery of oil and the fact that there are nominally these resources that ought to be shared, and the question is, because of our politics, because of the way in which our government works, the question of how to create a table at which we all sit and think about what is reasonable is the thing that is driving much of this discussion that we're having. So I wanted to look at this from kind of an American perspective, to offer an American lens to sort of view this as a way to sort of guide us in thinking about it. In the American context, it's clear. Most of us here who are sitting around this table, who are sitting on this program, who are in the United States, have been beneficiaries of some form or other of American policies that look to incorporate diversity, that do diversity, equity, and inclusion. Folks who are at the universities know that, hiring practices in the universities are are informed by diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that it is clear that there is a need for some kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion policy to be incorporated into Guyana in its current context because of the oil boom. And so I think what we have to begin to do, and this is what I wanted to kind of have us all agree on, is that what we have to do is we have to identify and address kind of the economic development practices in Guyana that in a way contribute to some form of systemic exclusion for Afro-Guyanese, for Indo-Guyanese in the rural areas, for Amerindians. So we have to look at this. We have to agree that this is something that really ought to be looked at if we're going to emerge on the other side with a society that is harmonious and one that does not sort of turn on itself. And then we want to think about how to implement these sort of practices across all of our organizations, institutions across the country. And then I think is the challenge. As I thought about this, you know, the history of Guyana and the history of the United States is quite different. You can see that in this moment, affirmative action, which has worked well in my view, and which again, I submit that we are all who are sitting in this context, who are in the United States, have been beneficiaries of. So we understand this is something that works, but we also understand that this question of equity in our society is also a very challenging one, and we ought to approach it with a kind of unique Guyanese sensibility. You know, in my cricketing group, once we sort of had the discussion of, you know, could I have a Guyanese cricket team that was all Afro-Guyanese or that was all Indo-Guyanese? And so everyone's paused for a moment and then thought, well, maybe we don't, it's not clear that that was representative of Guyana. And so then the question is, what do we do? And I think that this is what I want to open up in this discussion. What do we do in the areas of education that informs a future that is equitable? What do we do in the areas of the public service? What do we do in areas of financing small, catalyzing entrepreneurship among all sectors of our society? Are there special arrangements that we need to make for, as Taran just identified, our indigenous brothers and sisters? Are there things that need to be done in a very specific way to ensure that, you know, if the government of the day is of, and we can't run away from this. The APNU AFC nominally represents the broad Afro-Guyanese population, and whether it was designed this way, this is the way that it operates, and the People's Progressive Party represents this sort of Indo-Guyanese population. How do we sort of force a conversation about equity in housing, about equity in banking, about equity in education, and what does that look like? And that's where I wanted to start. And I wanted to apologize to you for being a bit late, but this is essentially what I wanted to agree on, that there's a need for us to have data to speak cogently about the issue that we're talking about. But if we were to simply think anecdotally, we know what we see. And so there are some systemic issues that we need to address. And the question is, how do we correctly identify and then address those economic development practices that in some sense contribute to systemic exclusion of various sectors of the Guyanese population? And so I'll leave it there and respond.
Dion,
I like what Professor Blackman has said, because the trend of thought and what Professor Kemraj also would have spoken about, the paucity of data in relation to our reality here in Guyana. And this paucity of data, sometimes we get a feeling that it's something that is nurtured and festered. There is really no drive to ensure that there is the kind of information that would give us an informed position on the status of the various groups in Guyana. At a recent forum, the UC Guyana Emancipation Lecture, it was touted that because frequently when you talk about ethnic discrimination and so on, you're told to provide the evidence. And so it was touted, gentlemen, that in some countries, in many countries, an ethnic disparity survey is done to determine the true extent of this inequity and inequality that we're talking about. And that survey usually in a fair system is carried out by the government. It is not left to any group to justify their position. How do you gentlemen feel about such a survey and its relevance again? Vincent?
In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I may have mentioned on the last program the need for ethnic disparity assessment. May have mentioned that. So I do agree that that is required.
As did Ravi. Ravi came up with the idea.
I didn't hear that.
I said Ravi had come up with the idea. He had proposed it way back and repeated it last time. Yes.
We share the idea. Whether Ravi is first, I'm second, we share the idea. But having said that, I also want to agree, and it doesn't in any way negate the first point, that we don't have sufficient data to do the analysis that would then be able to inform public policy, because I think that public policy is critical in the resolution of the problem. And much of what Professor Blackman pointed to, in a sense, was a call for public policy. But I also believe that even if one comes up with the data and the ethnic disparity assessment tells you the disparities, that we still have to try to determine what are the causal factors. Because it is only if one knows the causal factors that one can then really address the problem that you've been able to identify, having taken the quantitative approach, having done the assessment. So I think that the understanding the causal factors is critical. And important to understanding the causal factors is taking an approach that is not contemporary and pragmatic, but an approach that is historical and evolutionary. Because it is in that history and that evolutionary process that one would determine how we got to where we got to, and what is it that we have got to reverse, or what is it we've got to build on. And so I think critical to the process is looking at the causal factors as well as one way of determining how is it we have this inequity? What has fostered this inequity? And in fact, it is the evidence coming out of that process that will allow one to approach the question of equity from an equitable perspective. Approach the question of equity from an equitable perspective to say this, that yes, we want equity, but we cannot merely build equity on contemporary understanding. It has to be built on a historical understanding, because the inequity has historical roots. So, for example, if one wants to look at the question of the public service, which is so often talked about, and how it is populated, one cannot just merely say that the Constitution guarantees everybody the right to a job, and that the public service is overcrowded with people of a particular ethnicity, and therefore all we need to do is to create the opportunities for other ethnicity to get involved in the public service and to equalize it. Because there is a history to why the public service is the way it is, and there's a history as to why those people aren't in other places. And if you dealt with the public service isolated from understanding how they got there and why they're not in other places, then you would probably get them out into nowhere. That is why I'm saying that you have to be able to have an equitable approach to the inequity and a holistic and historical approach that will allow you to look at the various segments, where they're located, why they're located, and how that relocation, if that's what you want to do, can occur, how that can occur. And in doing that, we have to understand that we deal with diversity. Diversity in the sense that it's not a homogeneous society. And so not only from the standpoint of where people are located on the economic landscape or on the social landscape, we make that determination, but we have to look how they are located on the psychosocial landscape. Because coming out of the whole historical process has emerged not only where people are located, but how they see themselves in the location and how they see themselves at large and how others see them. And that has to be a part of the resolution of the problem, how others see them, so that we develop not only equity, but equity around the question of mutual respect for where we're at, putting aside the stereotypes, putting aside the prejudices, and attempting in a very objective way to develop a system of self-respect on one hand, to develop a system of some level of objectivity in what we do, which in itself will provide a framework in which one could easily go forward without some of the problems of inequity which we are speaking about. And this brings us back to the question of apartheid, because the way in which we have evolved, and the kind of stereotypes that we have developed, and the kind of prejudices that we have developed, have in fact demonstrated, initially from an ideational perspective, and subsequently from our practices, some of the elements of apartheid. So whilst I'm not saying that we are classically in a state of apartheid, I don't think anybody can justify that, that the discussion about apartheid, probably wrongly labeled, would lead us to understand some of the socio-economic problems which are current, why they're current, and therefore how they can be resolved. We have to look at, on one hand, individual Guyanese, on the other hand, the various communities, and then the nation at large, and how these three things are interrelated, how they're interrelated. And so there's really need for a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding where we came from, how we got to where we are at, and how we can find solutions to those problems in the context of mutual respect.
Thanks, Vincent. Ravi, Vincent has introduced some, we've all agreed that there is the paucity of data and so on. You've all agreed, and that there is need for this ethnic disparity assessment. So Vincent has introduced some key elements which he believes are critical to coming to a definitive position in terms of moving forward. Historical, psycho, right? How do you respond to Vincent's assessment of the need for these things?
Well, let me begin by saying that, like Vincent says, it doesn't matter who came up with the idea, but we've always been calling for what we call an ethnic impact statement, because we can't ahead of time prejudice what the outcome will be. We don't know whether it will be disparate impact all the time. We don't know. So we call it an ethnic impact, and then we let the data speak for itself. So in a sense, it wouldn't be, how do I put it, self-fulfilling, so to speak. It's an important concept. It's just like when I voted with the PNC back in the day when, in 2005, when the PPP insisted that we look into the assassination of Walter Rodney. And I said, well, if you already determined there was an assassination, what's the point of looking into it? So similarly, we don't know if there will be a disparate impact. So I would say we should emphasize and use the term there should be an ethnic impact. And I want to stress that it's not just in Guyana we need data. Let us forget all this hypocrisy that we've been using. When I came back to Guyana in '88, nobody even wanted to use the word ethnic. Mr. Hoyt publicly took me on in the newspapers to say, what is this man talking about Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese? And as late as 2015, when I gave evidence to, or 16, when I gave evidence to the Steering Committee on Constitutional Reform, my old friend Haslin, who's now departed, Haslin Paris, said, Ralph, what are you talking about ethnicity? There is no such thing as race or ethnicity. So the point is that we must accept that in Guyana, we need data on ethnic disaggregated, because that's how all Guyanese look at data. We have gone so far. If you hear somebody dead in Berbice, there are people who will say, well, who dead? Indian or African. Believe it or not, that's as deep as we have gone. And we shouldn't pussyfoot around the issues. I want to make that issue. So if all of us can take a unified stand and take a position with the parties that are competing for office, the PNC and the PPP, and get them to agree on utilizing ethnicity as a criteria for collecting data, I think we'll make great progress. The PPP, I know, has taken a firm position in the 32 years since I've returned here that they do not want to mention ethnicity because it will reify ethnicity. So I have always asked them, in the few times I interact with them, that, well, you haven't mentioned it in 32 years. Has it gone away? And of course, it's the elephant in the room. So there's no use hiding. So that, I think, is the first point. Let us have data that are disaggregated ethnically. Now, let's take one of the type of data we need to see how we're going to move ahead. I want to look forward prospectively. It's a new economy that's opening up. I think the whole nature of the game is changing with the kind of money that's going to come into Guyana. And we hear a lot in the past, and we're still hearing it again, the access to credit, right? That African Guyanese and indigenous Guyanese do not have the same access to credit that Indian Guyanese has. This has become almost a truth. It has become, something that nobody disputes. But in 2007, the Ethnic Relations Commission contracted our academic, who's now, I think, a vice chancellor at UG, Dr. Melissa Eiffel, and she did a study on this case as to the ethnic access to credit. And first of all, the only institution that actually collected data was the private small business. I think it's called not iPad. Is it iPad? The one that the Supersize group run?
iPad.
iPad. Thank you, Darren. They collect ethnic loans, and what it came out was that out of the 10,000 loans that were given out within a particular period, the breakdown was almost just like the rest of the population of Guyana in terms of African and Indian. So, but the interesting observation that Dr. Eiffel made at the end was that when she spoke to African Guyanese, a certain number of them, none of them had applied for a loan. None of them knew anybody who had applied for a loan. None of them knew anybody who had been turned down. But they were all of the view that African Guyanese are discriminated against when applying for a loan. So what she found, of course, in none of the commercial banks gave out data or took data along those lines. So what she did, she imputed who would get the loans depending on the areas into which the loans were given. So, for example, all of the commercial banks gave loans and had portfolios for rice and agriculture. So the imputation there, that was Indian then would be getting those loans. So these are indirect data which may or may not be accurate. So we do have some data here, and we need to, again, even these institutions come back to ask how are loans. But I want to conclude by saying this, that we Guyanese are so locked into the past, we are not aware, and our leaders are not telling us about the present. The IDB just came out with a study in terms of looking at the Guyana economy and from a financing standpoint. And they talked of the concept of a deepening of credit in this economy. You measure that by the proportion of credit that is given to the private sector. So for example, our number is 48. The rest of the Caribbean is around 53, but Singapore is 130. So there, it's a measure, compare the credit to the private sector compared to GDP. So Singapore has more credit to the private sector than the entire GDP of Singapore. And Singapore's GDP ain't no crumb, you know. The point we want to make is that it's a new economy, and the institutions themselves will have to look better at credit. Our credit, and Melissa pointed this out, Dr. Eiffel pointed this out, that we depend only on collateral, and only collateral that you could touch and hold. So if you have a big set of bonds in your cabinet at home, that doesn't count as collateral. A businessman could have a whole set of receivables, invoices, that doesn't count as collateral. So the institutions themselves will have to change, and that is where we will have to put pressure on these institutions to deepen the financialization of the Guyanese institutions. I want to conclude by coming back to what Vincent said, to go back historically. And when he mentioned specifically the public service. The public service, yes, we know it was historically of a certain people, kind of an apartheid. You had to be fair-skinned to get in the public service at a particular time, and you work your way up by literally marrying up and speaking a particular way. But then during the Burnham years, he quadrupled the public service, and somehow he stuck to the historical pattern, and that has now become ossified. So when the pressure came on Mr. Hoyt in 1989, when the IMF came down with their program, he had to fire almost 4,000 public servants. But my question is why the last government, the coalition government, the PNC APNU coalition government with the AFC, why did they, when they opened a public service training institute, the Bertrand Collins Institute, 92% of its students that were recruited from outside were all African Guyanese? It doesn't make sense. It shows you we're not changing anything.
Professor Kemraj?
Yes, so I think I strongly support Vincent's position and Ravi's position that we need data, and we need data that can show ethnic disparities. And the loan issue is an important one. However, as anyone trained in some statistics will tell you, you cannot only look at those who get the loan to make a decision whether you have discrimination. You also have to look at those who were denied, right? But another point is that if we collect very good data, we can also address these historical or evolutionary processes. And I completely agree that where we are today is a product of history, it's a product of our geography and all of that. I've been saying this for a long time, and you guys are older than me, but I've been saying this for as long. We need proper data in Guyana. I've been arguing for unemployment data way back when, 20 years ago, proper unemployment data in Guyana. And so we need data by ethnicity, and it's important for transparency purposes. You see, data brings transparency. Now, I agree that the commercial banks and the banks must be forced to collect the data. I'm pretty sure they have it. They have it. They just don't want to give it. I thought we have an ethnic relations body in Guyana. What are they doing? Isn't this the kind of stuff that the Ethnic Relations Commission should be doing? Should the government be more involved in these things? Home ownership, let's take a look, let's do a study of home ownership in the last 20 years, right? Where these homes going to, the ethnic distribution of home ownership, that'd be important because home ownership is an important asset, okay? So I completely agree with that. So, we have to. Now, one point before I go though, as we think about income, right? Remember, the GDP is an income measure, right? And so let's say right now Guyana's GDP is 6 billion, right? And this is largely because of the oil investments. Every year 60% of that is produced by ExxonMobil, right? So you have 40% to be divvied up by the private sector, other foreign companies like the foreign gold miners, the local gold miners, right? Then we have to look at the state-owned enterprises. We know Guy Super not doing so well, but the government still has certain enterprises. So this is how this income that is generated every year. This is how it's being shared, right? By locals and by foreigners. Okay. So I really cannot add any. You guys have said it articulately that we need data and we need ethnic distribution data to clarify this ethnic issue. Now, if we have good data, you could demonstrate clearly whether there is systematic discrimination because we can measure this, we can calculate this. And yes, if you have a descriptive data set, as Vincent mentioned, you haven't solved the problem. You haven't uncovered your causal mechanisms, right? But if you collect the data holistically, right? I'm going to take the loan issue for particular. We can control, we can know whether any ethnic group is systematically discriminated by loan, while also controlling for all these other confounding factors. So proper data and proper data collection, this is why also the government needs people who understand these issues, how to frame the studies, how to frame the data collection, because if it is done properly, we can figure this out, whether there is discrimination in loans in commercial bank. And one final point is, this is the point, commercial, if you privatize everything in the economy, right? The banks are foreign owned and local owned, right? I mean, correct me here, but Scotia is foreign. There's an Indian bank from India. Then there is Citizens Bank, which is Caribbean. Then there is the other one, which is also coming out from the Caribbean.
Republic.
And then of course the other bank, GBTI, is locally owned by Guyanese family. So we also have to figure out who are owning these banks and to make these claims. But I think the banks can do better. I think they can report the data better. And what about state development banks? Are we going to have development banks? This is the purpose of development banking. Commercial banking, by their very nature, ration credits, right? There's principle of credit rationing, right? They face a problem of asymmetric information, moral hazard, adverse selection, And unfortunately, this is how they operate. I'm not saying they ethnically discriminate, but I am pretty sure that if you don't have, regardless of your ethnicity, you don't have the collateral, you're not going to support. However, a state development bank is supposed to address these problems, right? Well-run state development bank, and nobody's talking about state development bank. I am glad that we got a new merchant bank, but the merchant banks are not going to solve this issue, right? It has a different role in the economy, right? So, so if we're going to move forward, we also have to think about rebuilding these institutions, and that they have to be run properly, okay? And I don't want to hear people say that the government can't run anything, because it's not true. Brazil has the most successful development bank, government-run bank, the BNDES. It gives loans to Volkswagen to open a manufacturing plant. It funded Embraer, the airline manufacturer, when it was still Brazilian.
All right, bro. We got 2 minutes, just about 2 minutes more. I want to give.
And then, of course, I'm going to come to the heart of capitalism, because we tend to forget this. The Export-Import Bank, which just broke the news in Guyana, that's going to give a line of credit, is a government-owned bank. It's owned by the federal government, right? Mortgages in the U.S., right? You have institutions with strange names: Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. These are government-guaranteed, government-backed agencies that are meant for adding liquidity to the mortgage market. Do we have any such plans in Guyana? Who are taking up these plans? What's the opposition role in this? Is the PNC going to come up with a plan? I want to see the PNC come up with a plan. I can't think of so many low-hanging fruits for the PNC right now. And thankfully, the PNC was not part of this discussion about apartheid. It was, I don't think it was the PNC was part of the event. I'm glad to see that. If they want to talk madness, they can talk madness. But I want to see the PNC come up with a financial plan to deal with these issues in Guyana. And we need a clever opposition. And I'm done. I'm sorry, Vishnu.
Yeah, Professor Blackman, you were going to be the last, have the last take on this in 2 minutes.
Well, I thank you. And so I wanted to start off by affirming Vincent's sort of the importance of acknowledging history and understanding that our history has sort of built systems have evolved historically that have kept some segments of our society from being able to create and build and retain wealth. And so I think this is something that we need to have broad acknowledgement of. And then the second step, which I think is really vital, and this is, again, coming through the American lens, as Taryn just described, is that then you have to think about targeting programs and initiatives that explicitly targeted to those vulnerable communities. And this has to be part of what we do as a normal business. And then the third thing I'd want to say is that this question of equity is something that can't come from a singular source. So the government in and of itself is not the only player in the game of equity. We need to have the private sector commission be a part of the equity discussion. And then the fourth thing, which we've all been really hammering, is that we have to be able to incorporate sort of equity and inclusion into the performance metrics. Now, acknowledging, targeting, collaboration, equity can't come from a single source, and then most importantly, measuring. So there has to be some concrete measure about which the discussion can take place. Now, in this question of measuring, and I wanted to sort of end on that, I think Taryn mentioned, and this was something that this article that I looked at. I think it was done by Constantine. Is it Constantine, Taryn? Constantine. Yeah. And so this is perhaps the most recent thing that I've seen that discusses the question of income as it relates to Indo and Afro-Guyanese. And the paper makes 3 points. It says 3 points are worth noting. First, ethnic distribution of income was relatively more egalitarian prior to 2014. Different ethnic groups gained and lost across the various income categories, which in a sense sort of undermined the tendency of group dominance. It notes that by 2014, Indo-Guyanese had the larger employment share in the public sector, private sector, self-employment, business partnerships. So correspondingly, they appropriated the larger share of labor income in that year, 2014. Most strikingly, and this is the point I wanted to end on, well, 2 points. Most strikingly, the degree of ethnic income inequality was highest during this period. Third, by 2016, the evidence shows that Indo-Guyanese had experienced a non-trivial reversal of fortune relative to Afro-Guyanese. So what this says is that our politics is deeply intertwined with the government in power in a very large sense. Kind of, there is enough volatility in the labor market share based on particular governments that are involved, and so this is something that I think we want to look at. And then finally, I wanted to come back to the point that was just made. I wrote my note down, and then my computer just. So I wanted to come back to close on these things. So we should, if for example, it should be relatively normal to be able to Google median household income for Afro-Guyanese versus Indo-Guyanese versus Indigenous Guyanese versus all kinds of Guyanese. If you Google that, you can't find it. The question of the percentages of loans to small businesses relative Afro-Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese. Small business by Afro and Indo-Guyanese. I was thinking perversely, supposing someone decided that, the stalls in Stabroek Market and in Border Market and in all markets should be apportioned by the percentages of the various groups in the population. Would that be a reasonable sort of equity play? So there are a number of questions that we have to look at that are very serious and can either change the way we live for the better, but it must be informed by some solid evidence of looking at ourselves in the mirror and being able to acknowledge this is where we are and have some consensus around the table about this is where we are. And I'll close by saying I am not going to touch the question of apartheid. There are elements of apartheid but I think I'm not going to touch this element of apartheid in this conversation. And that's what I would say.
Dion, you can close up.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for this very informative discussion. I think last week we said we should continue. I don't know if we should continue. Yeah, so if you call upon again, and I'm sure you will be, I'm hopeful that you will again make yourselves available so that this kind of sharing of information will continue. I just want to tell Ravi that, IPED goes into the communities after people to get them to be involved in their loan scheme, right? And that makes a big difference, right? Thank you once again, gentlemen, to the people who have been watching with us. We want to thank you for being with us. Look out for the next program, and we again will be discussing critical issues that are affecting us here in our beautiful country. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.